In this video, we will be adding the ability to sprint, as well as adding a short little animation or ramp up time to sprint, basically by toggling it on and off using our default character controller setup. So let's go ahead and get started with that. First thing we're going to need to do is have the ability to sprint. We're going to use the input settings in our project settings, and we'll add a new key for action mapping for sprinting. Let's call this one the sprint button. And we want to make sure that we use an action mapping because we're going to be toggling this on and off. We don't have any sort of access sensitivity like on a trigger on a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One. So now that our sprint button is set up, let's assign it to a key. Let's do the shift key. I'm going to do the left shift. And that's it. You can of course set this to whatever you want. And if you need to use a modifier, you can go ahead and toggle it right here. Though it would be weird to have left shift and shift. You don't need to save it. Let's close our project settings and get right to it. So since our controller controls everything, we are going to go ahead and set it up inside of our controller. And that was the wrong one. Let's open up the controller itself. Now, in a previous video, we have moved all of our input over to a separate graph. If you don't have one, you don't need to worry about it. But if you'd like, you can simply create a new graph over here, and you can move all of your input over to it, and it'll be treated just like if it was all on the same graph, except now that it's separate, we can keep things a lot more organized. We have moved our player controls over to their own little comment box, and we added in crouch previously. We'll add in shift this time. If you've added in crouch, hopefully you can figure out how we're going to do sprint. If not, we will walk through it now. So let's add the sprint button event, and we're going to toggle it on and off in order to sprint. Now, using the character controller, let's pull up our character, and using the character movement component, if you look through here and we look for run, well, we don't find run. And if we look for sprint, we don't find sprint. If we look at the different types of movement, there's none, walking, nav mesh walking, falling, swimming, flying, and custom. You don't have a run. Typically what you do in order to run is you change the walk speed. It sounds weird, but that's how it works. Right here we have our max walk speed, which is defaulted at 600. What we're going to do is when we toggle sprint, we're going to change that to 1200, and we're going to run twice as fast. And when we hit shift again, we'll toggle it back off and we'll walk at normal speed. So let's go ahead and set this up, and then we'll set it up in the character itself so it makes it easier, and then we'll set up a few options and we'll run through setting up a quick little timeline so you don't immediately run at full speed. So inside of here, what we want to do is we want to set the max walk speed on the character movement. Now this is going to be a lot of fun to get to when we do it here. If we were to, what we need is this. We need the character movement and we need the max walk speed. Now the character movement is part of our character. So how do we get it? Well, we need to do a little bit of trickery. If we get our controlled pawn, we're not going to be able to get the character movement, because the character movement is part of the character, not the pawn itself. So we need to cast this to our character. And this is one of the reasons we're going to change this shortly. And then we need to get our character movement, which is get character movement, which is in here somewhere. Get imparted, I hate finding these things. There we go, get character movement. So now we have access to the get character movement. And then we could do set the max walk speed. There we go. So this whole long chain here is what we need to do in order to set our max walking speed. And if we set to 1200, well, in theory, this should work. Let's go ahead and wire this up and test it out. So if I hit the shift key to sprint, I should be running twice as fast. We'll go ahead and hit play, and we will walk, and we'll hit shift, and now we're running twice as fast. Fortunately, I have no way of shutting it off, and we'll have to toggle that. So, the flip-flop node is what we're going to use to do that. Basically, input comes in and it runs the first option. After the first option is done, it's going to go ahead and run the second option the next time it comes through. And it's just going to flip back and forth between A and B. So if we have another max walk speed, and we go and hook this up to B, and we set this to 600, now it's going to sprint and do 1200 and walk and do 600. But if you notice, we kind of have an issue here because, well, of that. And then this only has one output, and now we're kind of boned. I guess we could copy all this. Well, what we can do to get around this is we're going to convert this into a pure node. Unpure nodes require execute wires. Wire comes in, this happens, wire goes out. Pure nodes, by right-clicking, pure cast, do not work that way. It travels backwards when something gets executed. So in this case, if we set it up, let's go like that. When we get to this point where we're setting it, the target needs to be filled in, which means it goes here, which means it goes here, which means it goes here, and then it fills it in the chain. So this node is not going to be called until we need it. And you notice I can plug it in here, and then we don't have an issue. The only caveat with that, and problem and potential issue, is there's no fail. This will return back something, either none or the FPS character itself. Since we know this is our FPS character, we're not going to worry about it. And we're going to fix this shortly, but just be aware, using pure nodes, if you fail, you're kind of screwing yourself. Only do it if you know your cast is pure. Like, for example, if you have one game mode and you're getting your game mode and then you're casting to your game mode, you're not going to worry about it failing because you're always going to have a game mode and it should always be the same one because you only have one. But right now we just simply want to get this working, and then we will iterate and adjust it. So if we run this, we should be running at 600. Now we're running at 1200, and now we're back to 600. But you'll notice a really sudden deceleration and acceleration of speed, which we will go over and how to fix. First things first, let's clean up this code. We know sprinting works, but the player controller should determine what happens when you push a button, but the player itself, the character, should determine what to do with that button. So we need to move this code back into our character, like we did with our crouch and our input button. So let's go ahead and open up our character interface, and let's add a new function called toggle sprint. We're going to go ahead and give it an input called isSprinting. And the thinking behind this is, what if we are sprinting and then we run into a cutscene and we want the character to stop sprinting? We want to disable them or something. We need to be able to tell our character, stop sprinting. We want to shut it off. Or we went into water and we shut off the sprinting, or, for whatever reason, we want to control the sprinting. So we set up a Boolean so we can tell it if we want it to sprint or not sprint. We'll go back to our controller. We want to copy out the appropriate code. We'll copy it. We'll go into our character. Now our character itself, we need to add in, we'll compile first. We've done a change to the interface, so we want to compile. And we'll do toggle sprint. Now we have an event for toggling sprint, which is basically going to be this event right here. Now, since we're going to use this Boolean input to determine if we're going to run or not, we don't need the flip-flop anymore. We'll just do an if. We're going to put in our sprinting, and then we'll do true, and we'll do false. Now here's the nice thing. We don't need the FPS character anymore. We have a character movement right here. Now, this is a version that has a self node. If we run this, we're going to have an issue. This is not valid anymore because we copied it. We want the actual character movement from our character hooked in like that. And now you'll notice it works. Well, it's hooked up properly. And you notice we don't have to cast anymore, and we will only be sprinting inside of our character. And the nice thing about this is if you have a character that maybe it's a heavy tank and it doesn't have the ability to sprint, you just don't hook up this event. The character will still be able to push the button. It'll still send it to, the player will still be able to push the button. It'll send it to the controller. The controller will send it to the character, and the character go, I can't sprint. I don't know how. So, go back to let's close our BPI. Go back to our controller. Let's clean this up. We still need our flip-flop, but we no longer need any of this. Well, we needed one of those, but we'll fix that. And we're not setting the walk speed in here. What we are calling is our toggle sprint message. Now you may be wondering, well, how do we tell it if we're sprinting or not? Flip-flops are awesome because they have an is-a boolean. If we're executing the A wire, is-a will be true. If we're executing the B wire, is-a will be false. So, first time in, sprint turns on. Next time through, sprint turns off. And then we can always call toggle sprint manually. We still need a target, of course. But the nice thing about this is we're using an interface on our character, which means we only need to get the pawn to call the event. There we go. Now we can call it on any character. Let's test this. Hopefully it didn't break. 600, 1200, and 600. There we go. Let's go ahead and hook up a print string so that way you can see it actually working. It'll help for the next section. And we'll get our character movement right here. Let's get max walk speed. We'll plug it in right here for debugging purposes. Hit play. 1200, 600. 1200, 600. Okay, so we know that works. We'll go ahead and disconnect these for now, but we will be using them later. Moving down here. So, let's go ahead and make a quick, not really an animation, but basically a sprint up and a sprint down. We're going to adjust our walking speed from 600 to 1200 over time rather than instantly, so that way you get more of a running up and down. Now the nice thing is it's really easy to do. We can use a timeline, and the timeline will basically scale it from one value to another over a certain time. So let's go ahead and add a timeline, and let's name this one sprint speed. And I named it that way on purpose, and you'll see why shortly. This part right here, we are no longer going to use here. This will be separated. We're setting them over here rather than over here. Now true, we want it to play, and false, we want it to reverse. Now we don't want to play from the start or reverse from the end. If we're in the middle of sprinting, for example, and going from walking 600, 1200, and then we immediately hit it again to slow down, we don't want to immediately jump to the max speed and then go backwards. We want to go from its current position, which is what the reverse will do, and then go back to the other position. Or we want to go from counting down to up. You'll see this in action shortly. But basically, we want play and reverse plugged in. Now, what we want to do is we go into our timeline, add a new float track, and we're going to call this one lerp 0 to 1. I like to name these basically what's going to happen. Let's do this over 2 seconds. We'll change our length to 2 seconds. And we're going to add 2 keys. Right click, add key. Right click, add key. Now we have a key at the beginning and the end. Let's actually make these proper. Time 0, value 0. This is good. The second one, time 2, value 1. And we'll go ahead and click these little zoomies so we can zoom in. Or you could scroll out. What we want here is basically 0% at 0 seconds, and then 100% or 1 at 2 seconds. We can close our timeline, and now we can see a lerp 0 to 1 node right here. So there are videos covering lerp, but basically how it works is we plug in our lerp value to our alpha. If it's 0, this value is used. If it's 1, this value is used. 0 value A, 1 value B. Anything between, it's a melding between those two. So if we were, for example, to put 1200 here, whoops, for our max speed and 600 here, basically, that's 500. We're going to go, get rid of that stupid 0. There we go. We're going to go between 600 and 1200, depending on where on this timeline we are. We have this now. We only need one of these. Let's move this down, and then we'll move this up, plug it in, plug in our value here. Let's see if we can get a little bit cleaner. Yeah, it's clean enough. There we go. So our timeline is going to run over 2 seconds. We're going to go from 600 to 1200, and we're going to set our max walk speed. Let's go ahead and put our print string back here. Let's get the walk speed and plug it into here. And this way we'll be able to see as it updates what our actual walking speed is. Let's run this. And now you can see it's going to go from 6 to 12. Whoops, and we're going to fall off. Let's try that again without falling off. Okay, let's get a little running. Here we go. So I hit sprint, and we now go from 6 to 12. I hit sprint, 12 to 6. And if you'll notice, I'm at 1200 going down. I hit it again, going up. And depending on when I hit it, we can go up or down smoothly. We don't have to fully come to a stop or fully come to a start. So I'll be running at 6. I'm at 12. Whoop, back down to 6. Back to 12. And I can toggle my sprinting on and off. Now obviously you'd want to use something like maybe a sprint meter or a cooldown or a timer. That's something that's covered separately. But this is basics of setting up a sprint and a timeline. Now it would be smart to have these things controlled by variables. So let's do that. Let's do it two different ways. We'll do a walk speed. And we'll try this again. Walk speed. Turn this into a float. We'll go ahead and compile and set our walk speed to 600. And then let's drag that into here. So now our walk speed is set by a variable. And then let's go ahead and we can right click on this and promote to variable, or drag off, promote to variable. Just another way of doing it. And let's name this one our sprint speed. And this is when we're going to run into an issue. You're going to notice it's already used by another function or variable. When we created this timeline, it created itself as a component and it named itself the name. So that's something to keep in mind. Timeline names, it's not just for decoration purposes, it's an actual variable because we can pull it off and then we get access to our timeline. So let's go ahead and just fix that very quickly by renaming. You could rename it over here, or you could double click slowly on here, or I think you can F2 to rename as well. So there's our sprint speed timeline. We'll name this back to sprint speed. Compile at 1200. Now you notice this says 1200 automatically, whereas I had to set the walk speed. When you dragged off and there was already a value there and I promoted it, it knew I wanted that value, so it went ahead and set it automatically to my sprint speed. So let's clean this up a little bit. It's always nice to keep things clean. One thing you may have noticed is we have not been commenting properly, so it would be smarter to comment properly. So like this would be toggle sprint, which I named properly. There we go. And this one is toggle crouch. Now something you could do is put these in their own event graph. You could put them into a function. See, this one's not too bad with toggling crouch, but if we wanted to use an animation or something like that, maybe we'd want to clean it up. This one gets a little bit long, and maybe we wanted to have a power bar or something go down every tick or something, so maybe, or activate a timer that depletes the power bar. This one's something that would probably be smarter to put into a function. So let's put into a function. We'll just do that right now. So we'll select these. We'll select all of this, and we will collapse to a function, which is going to fail. And this is one of those issues. You cannot put a timeline or any other latent thing like a delay in a function. So actually, we're just going to have to leave this alone. We can actually get rid of our print string. I don't think we need that. And maybe we would have something like the timer go down after we set the walk speed. Maybe we call another function that takes the timer. That's something that's more advanced and will not be covered. But that is going to wrap up this video. We have added to our controller the ability to sprint. We send it to any character that we're controlling through blueprint interfaces. Our character takes the event, depending on if we're sprinting or not, will, using a timeline, adjust the speed over 2 seconds. Let's say you wanted this over 1 second. Well, change your start and end values appropriately. So we'll change this to 1, like that. We'll hit play, and now over 1 second, we're going to go ahead and walk, run, walk, run. I got rid of the debug so you can't see it, but over 1 second is how I am now running. And of course, if you don't want that, you just simply go ahead and set this back how we had it, where your true sets the walk speed to walk speed, and your false sets the walk speed Sorry, your true is going to set it to the sprint speed, and your false is going to set it to your walk speed. So that's it. That's going to wrap up the video.